The wind came first. It always did in the northern Rockies at this altitude, not as a warning, but as a verdict. A cold, sweeping judgment that pressed down across the ridgeline and drove the temperature another few degrees below what the instruments read. By 0430, it was -12 Celsius. By the time the first gray light bled through the cloud cover, a 28-mile-per-hour crosswind had settled into the valley like a permanent resident, indifferent to mission timelines and command authority alike. 42 men lay along the eastern face of the ridge. They were still, disciplined, each one a product of years of selection, training, attrition, and refinement. The kind of refinement that removes everything unnecessary from a human being until what remains is pure function. They wore white and gray camouflage that broke their silhouettes against the snowfield. Their rifles were zeroed, their ammunition temperature tested, their firing positions dug with care into the frozen earth. They had been in position for 3 hours before first light. The target was at 1,500 yards. 1,500 yards. 863 meters across open, wind-blown terrain, uphill grade, at altitude, in crosswind conditions that had already exceeded the published effective engagement range for the weapon systems in use. Sergeant Major Douglas Holt had briefed the mission at 200 inches, a blacked-out tent with red-filtered lights and no chairs. He was 51 years old, built like a draft horse, and had shot combat-confirmed kills at 1,100 yards in 2 separate operational theaters. He had stood in front of the assembled unit and looked at his men the way a carpenter looks at a warped board with professional assessment, not alarm. "Gentlemen," he had said, "this is the distance. There is no other angle. There is no other window. The structure on that ridge has one exposure northeast face, approximately 3-meter gap between fortified walls. Our target moves through that gap between 0630 and 0700 each morning for approximately 4 to 7 seconds. That is our window." He had paused. 1,500 yards. 28 to 30-mile crosswind. -12 ambient. "We will conduct a live-fire qualification this morning before the window opens, to confirm drop data and windage. Every shooter on this ridge will take 1 shot. We are looking for anyone who can put steel on steel at this distance today." No one had asked questions. That was the other thing the selection process removed, the instinct to voice doubt. The test target was a steel plate, 12 inches by 12 inches, mounted at exactly 1,500 yards on a tripod stake, driven into frozen ground on the opposite ridgeline. A spotter team with a spotting scope and laser rangefinder was positioned 400 yards to the left in radio contact. At 0612, the first shooter took position. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski was 34 years old, 8 years in the unit, 4 combat deployments. His confirmed long-range record was 1,180 yards, set in a mountainous theater with lower wind conditions. He had spent 40 minutes the previous evening running atmospheric calculations on his ballistic solver, cross-referencing 3 different apps against his field data notebook. He lay down, adjusted his position by 2 inches to the left, set his grip, let his breathing slow. The spotter beside him, Petty Officer First Class Grant Sheridan, called out the wind one more time. Steady 18 at the firing line. Gusting 26 at mid-range. Estimated 23 sustained at target, right to left. Kowalski made a final scope adjustment, made his call on elevation 36.2 MOA of correction for a bullet that would drop nearly 2 stories over that distance. Added 12.5 MOA right to left windage to compensate for the crosswind. He exhaled. The trigger broke. The .338 Lapua Magnum cartridge ignited, and the bullet left the barrel at 2,940 feet per second. It would travel for approximately 1.6 seconds before reaching the target, an eternity in ballistic terms, long enough for the wind to do whatever it wanted. The spotter called it. Miss. Low and right, approximately 14 inches. Kowalski didn't move for a moment. Then he rolled off the rifle and nodded at the next man. The sequence repeated. Shooter 2 Lieutenant Commander Patrick Rains, 11 years in service, SEAL Sniper Course Honor Graduate, miss, high 11 inches. Shooter 3 Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, former Marine Corps Scout Sniper, cross-trained, miss, left 6 inches. Shooter 4, miss. Shooter 5. Miss. Shooter 6 called a wind gust, waited, fired. Miss. The gust had shifted between call and trigger break. Shooter 7. Miss. By Shooter 12, the senior enlisted advisor, Master Chief Eugene Haller, had walked down the line twice. He stood with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. He had been in long-range shooting environments for 23 years. He understood that at this distance, in these conditions, the margin of error was roughly the diameter of a dinner plate at the firing line, a difference of 0.04 degrees between a hit and a miss. The wind didn't negotiate. It didn't adjust for experience or rank, or the number of combat deployments logged in a man's personnel file. It pushed the same way for everyone. Shooter 15. Miss. Shooter 20. Miss. Mid-range gust just spiked to 31. Sheridan called over the radio from the spotter position. It's variable, not consistent. You're going to have to time it. Shooter 22 tried to time it. He waited 4 minutes for a lull. The lull came. He fired. Miss. Low. The bullet's still drifting on residual air movement after the gust drops, said Petty Officer 2nd Class Aaron Delacroix, who had a background in fluid dynamics before enlisting. Even in the lull, there's turbulence in the column. No one challenged the assessment. It was consistent with what they were seeing. Shooter 25. Miss. Shooter 30. Miss. At Shooter 35, a quiet had fallen over the line that was different from the disciplined silence of operational professionals. This was the quiet of men confronting the possibility that the mission itself might be impossible, not due to failure of nerve or skill, but due to physics. The mountain, the wind, the cold, the distance. These were indifferent to human achievement. Shooter 38. Miss. Shooter 39. Miss. Shooter 40. Senior Chief Petty Officer Bernard Calloway, 18 years in service, 3 confirmed kills above 1,000 yards. He took the longest of anyone to settle into position. He was meticulous in a way that looked almost ritualistic, adjusting his support bag by fractions of an inch, reading the mirage through the scope, watching the snow crystals on the ground in front of his muzzle to catch the last-second wind shifts. He fired. Miss. 2 inches right, closest yet. Calloway sat up slowly. He looked at the opposite ridge for a long moment. The wind is layering, he said. There's a different velocity at 3 separate altitudes along the bullet's path. You can't fully correct for all 3 with a single dope setting. You'd have to predict what each layer is doing independently and average it into a single number. That's not possible, said Shooter 41. It's not practical, Calloway corrected. Doesn't mean it's not possible. He stood and stepped back. 41 shooters. 41 misses. She had arrived at the staging area at 2,315 the previous night, 3 hours before the mission brief. Nobody had noticed. The duty log showed her name, Petty Officer 1st Class Alara Frost, listed as a late addition to the unit roster, transferred from a program that most of the men at the staging area had never heard of. The Arctic Warfare Sniper Development Program was not a course that appeared in standard SEAL training pipelines. It was a small, separate program, run out of a facility in the interior of Alaska, with a participant list that rarely exceeded 8 students per cycle. Its existence was bureaucratically real, but practically invisible to most of the naval special warfare community. She was 23 years old. She had not participated in the pre-mission brief. She had arrived after it ended, was handed a mission summary packet by a bleary-eyed logistics petty officer, and had read it in a corner of the staging tent over a cup of instant coffee that she didn't finish. She asked no questions of anyone that night. She reviewed the packet, reviewed the attached weather data, and then sat quietly for approximately 40 minutes doing nothing visible. At 0400, she had moved out with the main element. She had positioned herself at the end of the firing line, not out of deference or uncertainty, but because she had done a quick survey of the ridge geography when they arrived, and determined that the leftmost position offered the most unobstructed view of the crosswind indicators on the valley floor. The position also placed her upwind of the other shooters, which eliminated the minor but non-zero effect of their muzzle blast on her wind-reading environment. Nobody had told her where to go. Nobody had asked her where she was going. She was quiet in a way that was easy to misread. Staff Sergeant Kowalski, moving back from his shot, had seen her settling into position and had assumed she was a forward observer. He had not recognized her as a shooter until he noticed the rifle case she had assembled without fanfare, a custom-built chassis system in a flat white finish, with a barrel configuration he didn't immediately recognize. "Who's she?" he had asked Sheridan in a low voice. Sheridan had checked the roster on his tablet. Frost. AWSDP. Transfer. How old? File says 23. Kowalski had looked at her again. She was lying in the prone position, making small adjustments to her pack support, not looking at anyone. "She'll be watching today, then," he said. Not unkindly, just practical. Sheridan had shrugged and said nothing. As the shots accumulated 10, then 20, then 35, a few of the men had begun to notice her more actively. She hadn't been firing with the sequence. She had been doing something else. "What is she doing?" asked Petty Officer 3rd Class Dwight Farrell at the shooter 40 mark. From a distance, it looked like she was writing. She had a small notebook, waterproof paper, graphite pencil, and she was making notations between periods of stillness during which she watched the valley through her scope without firing. She had been watching for 90 minutes before her turn would come. "She's taking notes," said Chief Webb. "On what?" Nobody answered. Petty Officer Delacroix, who had been watching her most closely, said quietly, "She's tracking the wind pattern, the full pattern, not just what's at the firing line." "That's what the spotter's for," Farrell said. "The spotter's calling current conditions at 3 points," Delacroix said. "She's been watching the full column for an hour and a half." Nobody replied to that. After Shooter 41's miss, Master Chief Haller walked down the line. He stopped in front of Frost without ceremony. "Frost." She looked up from her notebook. Her eyes were pale, a gray-green that looked nearly colorless in the flat winter light. "You're up." She nodded, closed the notebook, set it beside her support bag. From somewhere down the line, a voice came, not loud, not aggressive, just carrying the weight of accumulated frustration. "Don't feel bad, Frost. Nobody's hit it." Another voice, quieter, "Let her try." A third, quieter still, "She'll miss too." Haller said nothing. He had read her file at 2100 the previous evening, before she arrived. He had read it twice. He had not shared its contents with anyone, because it wasn't his information to share, and because he had found, in 23 years, that what a person had done was less interesting than what they were about to do. He stepped back and watched. Elara Frost did not immediately shoulder the rifle. She lay in the prone position, cheek not yet on the stock, and looked at the valley for approximately 90 seconds with her naked eye. Then she looked at the notebook, a single page covered in columns of numbers and abbreviated notations, for about 30 more seconds. Then, she looked at the sky above the target. The clouds were moving at a different rate than the ground-level snow crystals. She noted this. It was not new information. She had been tracking it for 90 minutes, but she confirmed it one final time. What she was working with was this. At ground level, near the firing line, the wind was running left to right at approximately 18 miles per hour, with gusts to 26. This was the wind the spotter was calling. This was the wind that most of the shooters had been correcting for. At mid-range, roughly 750 yards out, in the valley bottom, the wind was behaving differently. The valley geography was creating a mild channeling effect, slightly compressing the airflow and pushing it closer to 23 miles per hour. This had been called by the spotter when he moved to the second observation point. At the far end, 1,200 to 1,500 yards. As the terrain rose again toward the target ridge, the wind was breaking. It was hitting the opposing ridgeline at an angle and deflecting upward in an unpredictable shear pattern. This was the layer that had been defeating the corrections. Shooters correcting for an average of 23 miles per hour of crosswind were being caught by a sudden deceleration or acceleration in the final 300 yards as the bullet entered the shear zone. Elara had been watching that shear zone for 90 minutes. She had noted the timing. The shear was not constant, it was cycling. Every 4 to 6 minutes, there was a period of approximately 15 to 25 seconds in which the deflection effect minimized. During those windows, the final stage wind was closer to 15 miles per hour than 23. The problem was that this window was invisible from the firing line. You could not feel it. You could not read it from ground-level indicators. You could only see it if you had spent enough time watching the snow crystals and small ice formations on the target side ridgeline, the ones disturbed by the passing air, and had built up a mental model of the timing. She had that model. She had also corrected her elevation dope for a factor most of the previous shooters had not explicitly calculated. The air density at this altitude was lower than standard, which reduced drag, but the cold temperature simultaneously increased the bullet's powder burn efficiency. The net effect was a slightly higher muzzle velocity than the standard load data suggested, which shifted the drop curve by approximately 1.8 MOA. Small, but at 1,500 yards, 1.8 MOA was the difference between center mass and a clean miss. She entered her final scope adjustments. Elevation, 35.1 MOA. Windage, 8.2 MOA right. The windage number would raise eyebrows if anyone saw it. The spotter had been calling corrections in the 12 to 14 MOA range for most of the shooters. Frost was dialing only 8.2, because she was not correcting for the average wind across the full flight path. She was correcting for the wind during the window, the 15 to 25 second period when the shear zone quieted. She was going to wait for that window, and she was going to time her shot to land in the shear zone when it was at its calmest. This required predicting, from 1,500 yards away, when a weather phenomenon would occur at the far end of a mountain valley. It required having watched it for long enough to know its rhythm. She picked up her pencil, made one final notation in the notebook, set it down. She settled her cheek onto the stock. Nobody spoke. It was an unusual kind of silence for a firing line, not the silence before a shot, which is focused and tense, but the silence of men watching something they don't fully understand. She was not firing. She had been in the prone position, scope to eye, for 4 minutes. The spotter, Sheridan, who had moved to a position beside her at Holler's request, had called the wind twice. She had not responded and had not fired. Shooter Calloway was standing 12 feet to her right. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has revised his initial assessment and is not certain what his new assessment should be. "She's waiting for something," Delacroix said, from behind. "The wind won't drop," said Shooter 41 Petty Officer First Class Nathan Briggs, who had missed by 4 inches an hour earlier. "It's been steady all morning." "She's not waiting for it to drop," said Calloway. Briggs looked at him. "She's waiting for a pattern." Briggs looked back at Frost. She had not moved. Her breathing was so controlled as to be nearly invisible. The slight rise and fall of her ribcage was the only indication that she was a living person and not part of the snow-covered landscape. Holler checked his watch. 0643. The mission window would open in 17 minutes. He said nothing. He had made his decision when he read her file. He had confirmed it when he watched her spend 90 minutes on data collection before touching her scope. He was prepared to wait. At the 4-minute 40-second mark, something changed on the far ridge. It was subtle. The spindrift, the fine snow dust that whipped off the surface rocks on the target ridgeline shifted. For a moment, it moved differently, less driven, more aimless, as if the force pushing it had briefly hesitated. Ilara Frost's breathing slowed by one more increment. Her trigger finger, which had been resting along the guard, moved to the trigger. She exhaled, not fully, just enough. The refined, partial exhale of a shooter who knows that a completely empty lung is as unstable as a full one. The reticle settled. The wind on the target ridge shimmered once more, the spindrift calming, the shear zone entering its quiet cycle, and she felt it before she could have consciously articulated it, the way a musician feels the tempo before the downbeat. And the trigger broke. GU. The 300 Norma Magnum round left the barrel at 3,100 feet per second. It was a different caliber from what most of the unit was shooting. She had selected it specifically for its superior ballistic coefficient at extended range in cold, dense air conditions. The case had been hand-loaded to her own specifications during preparation the previous week. At 500 yards, the bullet was still supersonic and relatively stable. The crosswind was pushing it, but less than the spotter's numbers would have predicted, because she had dialed for the window condition, not the average. At 1,000 yards, it entered the valley bottom zone. The air was slightly compressed here, the wind a few miles per hour faster, and the bullet's path bent fractionally. But the correction she had built into her windage accounted for this not by calculating it perfectly, but by calculating the integrated effect across all three zones. At 1,250 yards, it began to rise with the terrain grade, climbing toward the target ridge. At 1,380 yards, it entered the shear zone. The shear zone, in that 15 to 20 second window she had been timing, was running at 14 miles per hour, not 23. The bullet's remaining drift was less than her correction, which meant it would hit slightly left of center, approximately 0.3 inches left of center, on a 12-inch plate. It still counted. At 1,500 yards, 1,500 yards, the round arrived. The sound came 0.9 seconds after impact, traveling back across the valley at the speed of sound. But the visual was instantaneous for the spotter. Grant Sheridan, who had been calling misses for 2 hours, pressed his eye harder against the spotting scope. He blinked. He looked again. He keyed the radio. His voice was completely flat, the professional flatness of a man who is being very careful not to color the information with his reaction. "Hit," he said. "Center mass. Steel is ringing." The ridge did not erupt. There were no shouts, no congratulations, no immediate chaos of reaction. These were not men who expressed surprise easily, and their surprise was, in this moment, too large for easy expression. It sat in all of them at once, a shared and silent recalibration. Sheridan was still looking through the spotting scope. The steel plate was vibrating on its stake, sending fine tremors through the frozen ground. Calloway was the first to speak. "What?" he said. Not a question, just the word "alone," as though it had been expelled from him involuntarily. Petty Officer Delacroix, who had been watching her the most carefully of anyone, sat back from his own scope and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She waited for the shear cycle." "The what?" said Briggs. "The wind pattern on the far ridge," Delacroix said. "It cycles. Every few minutes, there's a brief period where the deflection drops." She was timing it. Briggs looked at him. "How long has she been watching it?" "Since before we started." Briggs said nothing. Alara Frost had not moved from the prone position. She was running the bolt, the clean, practiced motion of a shooter who has drilled the action until it operates below conscious thought. She chambered a fresh round. She did not look up. She did not look down the line. Haller walked to her position. He crouched beside her, unusual for a man of his rank and bearing, the deliberate lowering of himself to her level. "Tell me," he said. She turned her head enough to look at him. Then she said 3 sentences. "The shear zone on the far ridge cycles. The quiet window is 14 to 22 seconds, recurring every 4 to 6 minutes. I had to be ready before the window and let the window come to me." Haller was quiet. Then he said, "How long did you spend identifying the cycle?" 91 minutes. He nodded once. He stood up. He looked down the line at the assembled men, 41 of them, the best long-range marksmen the Naval Special Warfare Command had assigned to this mission. He said, not loudly, "She waited for the conditions to come to her instead of trying to correct for conditions that couldn't be corrected." Nobody replied immediately. Calloway said, after a moment, "We were all trying to solve the average. She solved the exception." Haller said, "Yes." While Frost conducted a final equipment check, recalibrating her scope for the slightly different bullet velocity after the cold soak, Master Chief Haller retrieved the personnel file and passed a summary to the 3 senior petty officers standing nearest him. The document was 3 pages. Most of it was redacted. What remained was enough. Petty Officer First Class Alara Frost, age 23, entered service at 18. Standard pipeline through BUD-S, which was itself unusual for a female candidate in the pre-integration period, and indicated she had entered under one of the specialized research billets that had preceded the broader policy. Changes. Assigned to Arctic Warfare Sniper Development Program, Eielson Air Force Base Annex Facility, Alaska, at age 20. The AWSDP was a 16-month program. Standard sniper schools ran 8 to 14 weeks, 16 months, in Alaska, focused exclusively on long-range marksmanship in Arctic and subarctic environments, a specialty within a specialty within a specialty. Confirmed training engagements at distances exceeding 1,400 yards. 11. In wind conditions exceeding 25 miles per hour. 6. In sub-zero ambient temperature. 9. Program record for confirmed hit on a moving target in adverse conditions, 1,618 yards. The record at the bottom of the second page was not for a training engagement. It was a single line, with the date, the location, and the distance. The location was a geographic coordinate set rather than a named place. The distance was listed in meters, 1,409. The outcome line was 2 words. Calloway read it. He looked up at Haller. "She's done this," he said. "Yes," Haller said. In the field, Calloway folded the document summary carefully and handed it back. He looked at Frost, who was making a small scope adjustment with the practiced, unconscious confidence of someone returning to a familiar task. "She didn't say anything," he said. "This whole time, she didn't say a word about any of this." Haller said, "No. She just watched the valley for 90 minutes and took her shot." Calloway looked at the ground for a moment. Then he said, "I've been in this unit for 8 years. I've never seen a shot like that." Haller said, "Neither have I." There was a pause. Then Haller said, "That's why she's here." At 0658, the radio from the forward observation post crackled. "Tango is moving. ETA to exposure point approximately 90 seconds. The valley had grown brighter but not warmer. The cloud cover had thinned slightly in the east, throwing a flat, directionless light across the snowfield that reduced contrast and made distance judgment harder. The wind had not dropped. The shear zone on the far ridge was in its active cycle. The spindrift was blowing hard off the rocks, indicating the 15-mile-per-hour plus conditions. Elara Frost was in position. She was exactly as she had been before the test shot, prone, settled, cheek on stock, breathing regular. She had added no ceremony to the interval between shots. She had not stretched or changed position or made any visible adjustment to her mental state. She had waited for the forward observation report, the same way she had waited for the shear zone, patiently, in stillness, without performing readiness for anyone watching. Haller was positioned 6 feet behind her and slightly right, where he could observe her scope picture via a secondary ocular unit she had set up without being asked. It was a detail that told him everything he needed to know about how she thought she had prepared for observation of her technique before anyone had asked for it, because she had anticipated that it would be requested. The radio crackled again. 30 seconds. Down the line, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The 41 men who had fired and missed were watching in the way that professionals watch something they don't fully understand but are prepared to learn from. Through the secondary ocular, Haller could see the reticle. It was not on the gap in the fortified wall yet. She was watching the shear zone. 15 seconds. He's approaching the exposure point. The target would cross the gap in the fortified wall, moving right to left, exposed for 4 to 7 seconds. At 1,500 yards, 4 seconds was an eternity. 7 seconds was generous. If the shear zone was active during those 4 to 7 seconds, the shot was extremely difficult. The wind correction would need to be in the 12 to 14 MOA range, on a target that was moving laterally at walking speed, in conditions where the bullet's path through the shear zone was unpredictable. If the shear zone was in its quiet cycle during those 4 to 7 seconds, if the window aligned with the exposure, the shot was very difficult but manageable. The question was whether the window would come. Haller watched the reticle. It was steady on the gap in the wall. Through his own observation, not the secondary ocular, he could see the target ridgeline. The spindrift was still active. The shear was still running. He's at the threshold. The target appeared in the gap. Even at 1,500 yards, through the high magnification spotter scope, you could see the shape of him, a silhouette, moving through a narrow opening between 2 sections of stone and timber wall, moving unhurriedly, unaware. The spindrift on the far ridge continued to blow. Frost had not fired. She was waiting. 3 seconds passed. The target was now in the middle of the gap. Exposure at maximum. 2 seconds remaining. The spindrift shifted. It was subtle, barely visible. But Haller had been watching it for 6 minutes, and he saw the change. The driven snow crystals losing their sharp, driven trajectory, softening into something more diffuse. The window. 1 second later, the rifle fired. No hesitation. No warning. The break was clean and instant. the natural culmination of a process that had been building for 91 minutes of observation, 4.5 minutes of waiting, and a trigger pull that weighed less than 3 pounds. The bullet was in the air. 1.6 seconds. On the far ridge, the spindrift was in its quiet phase. 14 miles per hour. The shear zone, for the next 11 seconds, was as close to calm as it would be all morning. The bullet arrived in the 7th second. The target went down. The radio from the forward observation post was quiet for 2 full seconds. Then, Tango was down. Confirmed single hit. Mission complete. She ejected the casing. It tumbled into the snow beside her, still warm, a small, brass-colored cylinder that contained the physical record of nothing more than a split-second event, but which would, in some future debrief document, represent the successful resolution of an operation that had required significant resources to mount and significant time to plan. She pressed the ejection port cover closed. She did not stand immediately. She remained in position for approximately 30 seconds, looking through the scope at the far ridge. It was a professional habit, confirming what she had done, reading the environment one final time, staying in the discipline of the process until the process was fully complete. Then she stood. She was not tall. In the white camouflage with the hood drawn up, she looked at first glance like a young soldier from any unit, slightly built, unremarkable in posture, carrying nothing in her expression that advertised what she had just done. Her hair was visible where the hood had shifted during the shot. It was white, not bleached or dyed, but genuinely, naturally white, the kind that comes in some people very early, a pigmentation characteristic that in another context might seem fragile or striking, but here simply made her look like she belonged to the landscape, like the snow had produced her. She started to break down her rifle. The first person to approach her was Calloway. He walked over from his position down the line and stood in front of her. He was a big man, 6'2", broad, with a bearing that came from nearly 2 decades of military service. He had 3 combat kills at ranges above 900 yards. He had a chest full of service awards that he never talked about, and an ego that had been professionally calibrated over many years into something small and functional. He stood in front of her and he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked up from the rifle case. Her expression was not surprised. It was attentive. "You don't," she said. "You didn't know. I underestimated you. You estimated me with the information you had." She snapped a case latch. "I'd have done the same." Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn the shear zone thing? The cycling?" She considered the question. "Norway. Second winter. The conditions up there create similar patterns in mountain valleys. You spend enough time watching, you start to see the rhythm." "Norway," he said. "I was there for 11 weeks. As part of the program." He nodded slowly. "How many shots have you taken at 1,400 yards or beyond in real-world conditions?" She thought about this. Combat conditions? Twice. Training conditions with confirmed environmental data? Maybe 40. Uncontrolled training, just fieldwork in Alaska, probably another 60. Calloway did the math quietly. She had more repetitions in adverse long-range conditions than anyone else on this ridge. Not because she was exceptional to begin with, though she might be, but because she had been sent specifically to a program designed to produce exactly this capability, and she had done the work. "You were quiet," he said, "the whole time. It wasn't my turn yet, but you knew." She looked at him steadily. "I thought I knew. I was pretty sure. I didn't know until the shot landed." He appreciated that. It was the right answer, the accurate answer, the one a person gives when they are telling the truth about their process rather than performing confidence for an audience. He extended his hand. She shook it. They were extracted by helicopter at 0730. The flight back to the forward operating base was 47 minutes over terrain that looked, from altitude, like a white world without edge or boundary, a continuous surface of snow and stone and shadow that the winter had made into a single, undifferentiated thing. The sun was beginning to break through the cloud cover in the east, sending long, flat angles of light across the ridgelines. Frost sat in the aft section of the helicopter, near the window, with her rifle case on the floor between her feet and her notebook open on her knee. She was making final entries, recording the confirmed dope data, the shear cycle timing, the ammunition performance data, It was the kind of record-keeping that had no immediate audience and required no one else's acknowledgement. Sheridan, who had been her spotter for the mission sequence, was sitting across from her. He watched her write for a few minutes. Then he said, "For what it's worth. Calling that hit that was the cleanest 2 seconds of my career. Just watching the target go down and knowing I didn't have to call a miss for the 43rd time." She looked up. A very small expression crossed her face, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "You had a long morning," she said. "We all did." She looked back at the notebook. The cycle was there from the beginning. If I'd been up first, it would have been there too. "You think anyone else on that line could have read it?" She considered this for a long time, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "Calloway might have gotten there, given another 30 minutes of observation. He thinks carefully. But you'd already had 90 minutes. I got there first," she said. Not boastfully, just as a statement of sequence. Sheridan nodded. At the forward operating base, there would be a debrief. Notes would be compiled. Reports would be written. Somewhere in the chain of documentation, the fact of the shot, its distance, conditions, and outcome would be recorded in enough detail that it could be examined by people who needed to understand what was possible and what the conditions for possibility looked like. That documentation would exist in a file that most people would never read. The shot itself would travel a different path. It would move the way these things always moved in tight communities, through conversation, through the specific reverence that skilled people extend to evidence of superior skill, through the gradual accumulation of a story that, with each retelling, would gain the weight of something larger than its origin. By the time the helicopter landed, most of the 41 men were already carrying the beginning of that story. They had seen something today that they would spend years trying to describe to people who hadn't been there, and they would find, consistently, that the description was inadequate, that what they wanted to convey was not the mechanics of the shot or even its outcome, but the quality of the waiting. The way she had lain on that frozen ridge for 91 minutes in -12 degrees, watching a mountain, and then in the space of a single exhalation, had assembled everything she had observed into a single, irreversible action. The cold, the stillness, the notebook in the snow, and then the shot. Master Chief Haller submitted his after-action report at 1400 that afternoon. The section on personnel performance was factual and brief, as his reports always were. It noted the conditions, the sequential test results, and the outcome. It noted the application of atmospheric layering analysis to the wind correction problem. It noted the use of a timed engagement window based on observed weather patterns. At the end of the personnel performance section, he wrote one additional sentence. It read, "Petty Officer First Class Frost demonstrated a capability at this distance and in these conditions that I have not previously observed in any shooter at any level of training, and I recommend her performance be formally documented and studied for its instructional value to long-range marksmanship programs." This was an unusual addition for Haller. He did not typically recommend things. The report moved up the chain, down on the range, that afternoon, because training did not pause for missions, because there was always another task and another line. The men who had been on the ridge that morning went back to their routines. Cleaning weapons, running PT in the cold, eating meals in the mess facility where the heat was aggressive and the fluorescent lights made everyone look slightly ill. At some point in the afternoon, the conversation that had been moving quietly between them since the helicopter landing arrived at a natural language for what had happened. Nobody decided on the word. It was not a committee decision or a formal designation. It emerged the way language emerges in small groups that have shared a specific experience out of the accumulated weight of inadequate alternatives until the one right word becomes obvious. Briggs said it first, in the mess line, to Webb. He said, "Did you know she had a confirmed kill at 1,400 meters? Actual combat?" Webb said, "No." Briggs said, "Yeah. Year before last. Northern sector." Webb was quiet. He had a confirmed kill at 980 yards, which he was quietly proud of, which he would not be able to think about in quite the same way ever again. He said, "What do you call someone like that?" Briggs said, "I don't know what they called her before today." He paused. "I know what I'm calling her now." The word was legend. It passed through the unit in less than an hour. By dinner, it had reached the Forward Operating Base Command staff. By the next morning, it had reached the broader Special Operations community that shared the facility. By the end of the week, it had made its way into the informal channels through which these communities transmitted their most important intelligence, not battlefield intelligence, but the intelligence of human capability, the intelligence of what is possible, the intelligence of where the actual ceiling is and who has touched it. The white-haired girl, Frost, the rookie who waited 90 minutes to take one shot, the one shot that landed 1,500 yards in a 28-mile crosswind at -12 after 42 misses. In the northern Rockies, the winter was indifferent to all of this. The snow continued, the wind continued. The shear zone on the far ridge cycled through its quiet intervals and its active ones, as it had for centuries before this morning, and would for centuries after. The steel plate that she had hit was still there, ringing faintly in the wind like a bell that could only be heard if you knew what you were listening for. The mountain didn't give anything away. It never did. But on this morning, one person had asked it the right question, in the right way, at the right moment. And the mountain, indifferent as it was, had no choice but to give her the answer.